Good morning. Hi there, friends. How are you all doing on this Thursday morning? It is the 15th of September, and the year is racing away. So today I'm doing something a bit different. I'm going to do what I call a knit and chat. This is sort of part travelogue. It's a knitting-inspired travelogue, a little bit of an insight into my journey in India. But I'll tell you what I'm making to start off with. Here is this lovely Scrappy Shawl. Let's see. Yes, there we go. This is by Pia Trans of 50 Fabulous Knits, and we are going to be having a fun time with Pia in October on her 24-hour knitathon. Now, I have a few very exciting things that I'm going to be doing with her, and some giveaways and some fun. But today, I just thought I would make a bit of progress and tell you a little bit about my India story. So, as I said, this is knitting related. Knitting has been part of my life forever. And even when I was living in India for the 12 years that I have been living in India, I have always been knitting. In the early days, I was in South India and in Varanasi, which is in central India. And there you can find lots of these little stalls. They're not really shops, they're just sort of on the pavement with pallets of bright colors piled up to the ceiling. You can hardly get inside the shop. It's a very tiny little space, but all that yarn is 100% acrylic. And it's very colorful, and it didn't stop me knitting. I used to make fingerless gloves for everybody in the winter, and socks and beanies, but that was about it. Then over the years, I moved away. I moved higher up into the mountains. I lived in Varanasi for 2 years. Varanasi is one of the most ancient cities in India. It's on the banks of the Ganges. It is spectacular, very historic. The one side of the bank is just lined with very ancient, towering old palaces, temples, and of course what's called as the ghats. The ghats are the steps, and these are very important places where people come on a daily basis, either to pray, to make offerings to the Ganges at sunrise, and even just to take their regular bath, as a lot of the very simple homes in the old section of Varanasi do not have bathrooms. So they would come and take their bath, they'd brush their teeth and wash their hair and have a swim and sweep aside the flowers from the burning ghat and other detritus that would be floating around in the Ganges, and do their daily ablutions and say their prayer and light their candle, and off they would go. So that is where I started out living. I lived right on the banks of the Ganges, directly above one of the very famous cremation grounds, which might sound pretty awful, but in fact it was just fascinating really to have visibly death being such a part of life. And that is one of the things in India that does surprise many, but in fact makes so much sense, is that life and death are one and the same, the beginning and the end, and nothing is really hidden. It all goes on. So that's where I lived for a few years. until one day I decided to go up and discover this mysterious and mystical place that I had heard of called Rishikesh. Now, Rishikesh is another very ancient and very spiritual place on the Ganges, the sacred Ganges River. It is situated at the foothills, I guess you would call it, although there are no hills. It's the foot mountains to the Maha big mountains, which are the Himalayas. So here the Ganges comes gushing out of these deep valleys and gorges, two rivers, one called the Alaknanda, the other called the Bhagirathi, and they come from the very high places in the mountains, Badrinath and Gangotri, which are places where the sages and the devout Hindus would make their pilgrimages. Now, many, many years back, there was not actually a road up to these sacred places called the Char Dham, which means the Char is 5 and Dham is the holy places. So these were the 5 most holy temples, very auspicious places to visit at least once in your life. And people would make this journey on foot. And this would take months, because from Rishikesh, which I think is approximately 200 odd kilometers away from the mountains itself, there would be no road traffic. There would be walking paths through the jungles, along the rivers, over the mountains, and those who wanted to take blessing or give thanks or ensure good karma in their future lives would make this pilgrimage on foot, and many would never return because it was wild out there. You know, the weather was wild, there were wild animals, there were leopards, there still are leopards. It's treacherous landslides and glaciers. So to make that journey and to return successfully was really a blessing. But nowadays, of course, there is a road. There are many roads. And in fact, currently they are making somewhat of a highway up to these mountains, which is very sad. Very, very sad, because that means that everyone and anyone can go to these places, and everybody wants to go to these places. So there's been a mad scramble of building tourist accommodations and really bad constructions. And in 2013, I think it was, there was that major disaster at Kedarnath, which is one of the most holy temples of Lord Shiva, the Kedar temple, where the glacial lake burst and swept hundreds of kilometers down the valley, down the rivers, wiped out many buildings, many villages, and thousands upon thousands of lives were lost. I was actually on my way up to this temple at that time, and I had stopped to stay at the home of a dear friend when this happened. Luckily, we were safe, but we had to evacuate our home, which was on the banks of the Alaknanda, and it was quite scary. But yes, so these holy places are now tourist places, which is quite sad. Nevertheless, I lived in Rishikesh for around about 5 years. Rishikesh has these 2 wonderful julas, which a jula is a bridge, a footbridge which crosses the Ganges, and I lived on the forest side of the northernmost jula, Lakshman Jula, and I lived a very peaceful life with the forests to my back and the temples and the Ganges to my front. And when I went out for walks, there would be loads of wild peacocks, and there were even elephants there in the forest. Used to come across quite a lot of elephant poop, and we did see some elephants. But it was really glorious and very peaceful. After some years, India discovered outdoor sports. Indian people started becoming wealthier and able to take holidays. And so Rishikesh then started to turn from a very holy and sacred place into a tourist venue. And that meant bungee jumping and river rafting, and there was never any peace. You know, there would be hundreds of rafts going up and down the river all day long, people having a great time, screaming, shouting, taking selfies and having a joyous time, but it really disturbed the peace of the area. So after 5 years, I decided that I needed to move further into the mountains. At that stage, I had been pursuing a spiritual path. I was involved in daily rituals. I bathed every day in the Ganges, which luckily and thankfully up there was crystal clear, freezing cold, very deep and quite dangerous. But I had a very peaceful time there. But I was already involved in knitting. I would return to South Africa every year, and I would bring back some yarn and knit shawls, which I would sell to people. So after 5 years of that existence, I decided that this was time now to move further into the mountains. So I had friends who had encouraged me to visit a place called Devi, and I'd heard a lot about it. Now this is much closer to the Himalayas. It's at the elevation of over 2,000 feet above sea level, and it's on a beautiful ridge where there's this lovely Devi temple, which means a temple to the goddess, and it's called Devi. So I went there one day to take a look, and I was just completely blown away at how magnificent it was up there. One lives on the side of the mountain, one has complete 360-degree views, circular views of snow-covered Himalayas, which are so high that sometimes one can't see them because you're looking too low. One day I did go up to this lovely temple, which was sort of the viewpoint to look at the mountains. I would do that every time I walked up the hill to go to the shops. One went by foot there, and I went up to take a look at the view. There were lots of clouds, and it was a gorgeous view, and I could see the clouds. I could see little bits of mountain peeking out, but it wasn't the best view, wasn't the best day for seeing the view. So I turned around and I was about to go back, and I saw somebody else sitting there, and this person said to me, "Did you see Nanda Devi?" Now, Nanda Devi is one of the highest Himalayan peaks. I think it's 7,000 meters, if I'm not mistaken. It is covered in snow year-round. And I said, "No, there are too many clouds." And he said to me, "No, just look up." And I thought, look up? I was looking up. Well, I was sort of looking up there, and he meant look up there. And so as I looked up, I realized that this mountain was so high and so huge and so majestic that I just wasn't looking high enough. So that became my spot. I would go and sit there very often and look up. Sometimes I would need to look up because the clouds were not there, but this was for me an expression of the Creator, of God, for want of a better word. Every time I went and sat there, I just felt totally connected to everything, and to my creativity, and to the nature, and to the loftiness of life in the mountains. So that is where I spent the last 4 years of my existence, there in the Himalayas. I also made a wonderful discovery when I moved up there, and that is that area came to be what I called a wool heaven or yarn heaven. There were quite a few weaving projects, knitting projects, loads of goats and sheep in the mountains, and I started to explore the possibilities of what was happening. And I found some wonderful yarn. Most of the yarn was extremely rustic yarn. They were not doing a very detailed or commercial processing at all. A lot of the garments that were being made were very thick, heavy coats, basically just necessities for the winter wear, or blankets, or even carpets were being woven out of this wonderful rustic yarn. And I even discovered wonderful natural yarn dyers. And very close to where I was living, I discovered a project or an NGO that encouraged and taught women to knit, and knit garments to sell for profit so they could make a living for themselves. Now, these women would be farmers. I wouldn't call them farmers' wives because they are the farmers. In the mountains, the men are pretty lazy, let's say. The women do all the work. They're out there doing their thing. And I don't think they get to keep much of their profit. Sorry, excuse me now. I'm going to spit splice my little piece of yarn. So I'm going to suck on my yarn for a second. I'm using lots of colors in the shawl, and I do not want any ends. So here we go. I'm going to rub it together now in my palms. So yes, I went and paid them a visit, and I noticed that they were making lovely things. They were making sweaters and vests and lovely little toys, which I bought a few for my granddaughter, and beanies and scarves, but they were knitting with 100% acrylic yarn, which was such a pity, after all this work that was being put in. Sorry, I realize I might have to just pause this while I rub. Okay, splice over. It was just shaking the camera terribly. So I met one of the people in charge, and I told them of my ability and my knitting skills and my design skills, and they invited me to come and do some workshops there with the ladies. Mostly I was teaching various skills in order for them to make their garments more commercially viable. I taught them how to knit on circular needles, which they'd never seen in their lives before. And we did do our best to source some pure wool. It was quite rustic, but after a few months and a lot of researching, we found some really nice wool. So I was working in the mountains, living there in the middle of all the wool with the knitters, going to the villages, and so I was not allowed to actually do paid work while I was in India, as I was on a tourist visa. So I would do voluntary work. They would pay for me to stay and eat. I would normally live with a family, mostly on a farm, a very rural environment with sort of 4 generations living in the household. It was a large house, but there was not much privacy. It was greatly entertaining, very interesting. I learned a lot, but I did have to sort of hide away sometimes to get a bit of privacy, as if my door was open, it was just open invitation for anybody to come in, sit down on my bed, and just stare at me or watch me knit or chatter away endlessly. There was this the great-grandmother, who must have been, it's very hard to know how old they are. They always look much older than they actually are in years, because they work very hard. They have a very hard life and they age. But the great-grandmother would come in, burst into my room, sit down on the bed and start chatting and chatting and chatting, and pick up my handbag and look at my cell phone and examine my knitting and talk away to me. Although I do have quite a good grasp of Hindi, this particular dialect is Garhwali, and I could not understand a word, but that did not stop her, and that was entertaining. It was most entertaining. So I would go there and stay with them. Some of the ladies who lived in the house were also the knitters, so they would just end up in my room every evening, and we would all just be sitting there knitting. And they were very curious about shawls. I was knitting shawls then, and so I taught a couple of them to make shawls. They would wear woven cloth shawls, which is what everybody wears in the market, but it became evident that if you had a knitted shawl, well, this was something special. So pretty soon I had a lot of ladies wearing knitted shawls. That was a beautiful part of my life. I really enjoyed that. So I would do that for sort of 2 months. Then I would go back to my home on the edge of the mountain and just get my breath and have some privacy. Oh, excuse me, have some privacy and carry on doing what I was doing. Then one day I was probably due to travel back to South Africa. And so this is very high up in the state of Uttarakhand. And how one would get there, let's say from Delhi, which is where I'd always fly into, is by train. So the last train station was a station called Kathgodam. So one would travel by train to Kathgodam, and then one would pick up a private taxi, which would take another 3 or 4 hours on the beautiful, beautiful mountain passes up to my home. So on this occasion, I was traveling back. So I had got my taxi and I had booked my train, and I was traveling back to Kathgodam, which is a main station. It's the last station on the line. And I arrived. One always has to, be prepared to arrive for trains and planes and everything hours in advance, because you never know what might happen on the way. And in fact, I did once miss my train due to unseasonal snowfalls which blocked the road. But anyway, on this day I got there in time, and in fact I had probably 2 or 3 hours to wait. So I went onto the platform, and they have a lovely big waiting room. Wonderful waiting room where probably 50 or 60 people can sit comfortably and wait. The lighting is good. Most important, there are a lot of places where you can charge your mobile, and people sleeping, people sitting, people waiting. So I sat down and I took out my knitting and I started knitting. Then I did realize that my mobile was getting pretty low on charge. So I spied the charger point, and the minute it was free and there was a nearby seat, I jumped up and I went and sat down next to this lovely lady, and I plugged in my mobile and I started knitting. Well, after a couple of seconds, she looked over and she said to me, "Oh, you're making a Stephen West shawl." Well, I could have fainted. So I said, "Yes, you're correct." And we struck up this wonderful, wonderful conversation. This lady was probably in her late 60s or 70s. She was a retired doctor who lived up in that area, and she ran a knitting project where she had also ladies come, and she taught them all the lovely techniques and They made garments for order. They made a lot of babies' garments and, practical things that one needs in the mountains. And we became great friends. We became such great friends. It was just miraculous to find somebody in the middle of the mountains who could recognize a Stephen West shawl. So that made me really happy. She now does have actually an Instagram, and that is called Needles and More. I will put a link so you can go and have a look at the wonderful work she does. Don't think she has a YouTube channel, but we have kept in touch, and we will definitely one day when I return, which will definitely be in February next year, we will connect and I will go and visit her, and we will be doing some knitting together. So, yes, that was my wonderful Stephen West Knits moment, sitting in the waiting room in the mountains in India. Now, I am taking a tour next year in February, and we will be going to the mountains. This is not going to be specifically a craft tour, although there will be definitely visits to the knitters and to the weavers. There's also wonderful weaving projects there. And I also discovered a wonderful project that does natural dyeing, indigo dyeing. So this could well be all part of my upcoming tour in February. We will start off in the desert in Rajasthan, which is another gorgeous place that I love to go. And I will be talking about that in my next little knit and chat. So today I think that's it. That's my little story, my knitting travelogue. And I did recently call myself a nomad rebel fiberista. It's quite a mouthful. Well, I am a nomad knitter. I knit everywhere. I am a rebel. I do my own thing, and I am totally into fibers. So I hope you enjoy this journey with me. And if you'd like to come on a journey with me to India, you will have a lot of fun. I have some very deep insights into many aspects. I speak Hindi. I have lots of local friends, and I have explored the crafts in depth, so I have a lot to share with you. But thanks for just having a little sit in with me today, and I wish you all the best. Happy knitting, spinning, crochet, happy life. Thank you, and namaste.